Ask the Atlantic's Yair Rosenberg why he thinks there could be a shift going on with the war in Gaza. And he'll tell you, just look at Benjamin Netanyahu's war cabinet.
A top member of Israel's war cabinet and a rival of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is warning he will resign if the prime minister does not change course in Gaza.
So, Nick, what happened today in Israel? It looks like the private infighting has burst into public view.
Over the past week, one by one, the men who should be working with Prime Minister Netanyahu to plan this war have come forward to say they do not support Netanyahu's leadership. They specifically say he's got no plan for what happens after the fighting is done. I mean, does it feel like we're entering a new stage of this war to you?
I think Israel itself is entering a new stage when it comes to its debate over the war.
In the days since this very public break, headlines from the Middle East have just kept coming. First, the president of Iran, Israel's main adversary and Hamas's main supporter, died in a shocking helicopter crash.
There are multiple reports now coming from Iran within the last few minutes that Ebrahim Raisi is dead.
Raisi, the foreign minister, and several others killed after the helicopter was forced to make a hard landing in the steep mountains of Iran.
The next day, pressure built in the region in a different way.
In an unprecedented announcement, the International Criminal Court today said it was seeking warrants to arrest not only the leaders of Hamas, but also the elected leadership of Israel on charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity.
The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court announced he was seeking arrest warrants against leaders in both Israel and Gaza for their actions during their 7-month war. Yair says all this information has a way of clouding the picture, preventing you from seeing how alliances are changing and what that might mean.
It's all happening all at once, and sometimes these events impact each other in unexpected ways.
Today on the show, internal and external pressures on the war in Gaza. Will they shift what happens now? I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. This episode is brought to you by Discover. When it comes to your finances, Discover wants you to know they are the credit card that is always there for you. With 24/7 U.S.-based live customer service, everyone has the option to talk to a real person anytime, day or night. Yep, that means no more waiting for, quote, normal business hours just to get a hold of someone. We are talking real service from real people whenever you need it. Get the customer service you deserve with Discover. Limitations apply. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
Hi, I'm Katie Riley. On the Slow Newscast from Tortoise, Donald Trump became the first former U.S. president in history to face a criminal trial.
The defendant repeatedly made false statements on New York business records.
This is not a trial. This is not an act of criminality.
We cannot and will not normalize serious criminal conduct.
This is the story of his first week in court, told through the transcripts. Listen now to the Slow Newscast wherever you get your podcasts.
The biggest update out of the Middle East this week didn't actually come from Israel. It came from Iran, where news broke that a helicopter carrying Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi, as well as the country's foreign minister, crashed on Sunday, killing everyone on board. But Yair says, shock value aside,
it's hard to say how important it is because, as those who follow Iran know, the Iranian politics and the people who could become president in the first place are determined by the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei. And that person's still there, right? He's 85 years old. He won't be there forever. And Raisi might have been a possible successor. But Raisi only was in the position he was in because the supreme leader and the clerics of Iran decide who can run for president in the first place, which is why you don't get a female president of Iran or a Christian president or a Jewish president or even the wrong kind of Muslim president. That's decisions that the theocrats who run Iran make. And so this isn't the decision maker who goes down, but he is an important functionary, and he might have become more powerful in the future, and now he won't, and there'll be an internal power struggle to fill that vacuum.
For those who don't know, I wonder if it's worth just laying out who Ebrahim Raisi was and why he was important.
So he became the president in part because he was a true regime loyalist. He took part in a whole bunch of horrific crimes against Iran's own people, executing a lot of people, involved in many of the regime's bloodiest actions. But that means you're a true believer. And, he shared the conservative theology and politics of the supreme leader. That's one reason why he was sort of tipped to be someone who could maybe one day be the next supreme leader. And so the Iranian people themselves, and we've seen some evidence of this, although it's repressed in their media, right? A lot of the Iranian people were celebrating that Raisi was gone because this is somebody they see as their oppressor.
Yeah, one Middle East commentator referred to Raisi as almost universally hated. Like he was in charge of the country during the protests in 2022 and 2023.
Yeah, so it's not, this is not someone who's greatly lamented. And at the same time, another reason why the reaction is muted is because I think most Iranians know that their situation will not change dramatically because this person is gone.
Right. You've said, and many have said this, that Raisi was being positioned to be a successor to Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khomeini. He's 85. He's the longest-serving head of state in the Middle East. He steered Iran into an extremely hardline direction. And there are reports that his health is in decline. And of course, Hamas, the terrorist group that Israel is fighting in Gaza, is widely seen as an Iranian proxy. So I'm just wondering how all of this might influence the war in Gaza.
So it's hard to say about the war in Gaza specifically, but Iran funds and trains a whole bunch of proxy armies from Hezbollah in Lebanon and elsewhere, and Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis, and several others. And those forces destabilize all sorts of countries, and as you said, are part of an incredibly aggressive foreign policy that has been in place for some time. Now, it's not clear that there's any chance of that changing, since, again, it's set by the supreme leader and then just carried out by others. But given when your president and foreign minister go down, you do have this, time of internal upheaval. They have to have elections within 50 days. There's going to be lots of power jockeying to figure out who's going to fill this vacuum, and then also who might be tipped to be the next supreme leader, since a big candidate just dropped out, as people try to consolidate support. So you might see Iran's, leadership turning somewhat inward while they deal with these things, rather than looking outward as much and attempting to, sort of supercharge their very bellicose and aggressive foreign policy. So in the short term, this could tamp some things down, but it's hard to know.
Around the same time, Iranians were trying to make sense of this crash. Israelis were dealing with their own turmoil as members of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's wartime government began contradicting each other publicly.
So you had this dramatic moment where the defense minister of the state of Israel, a former general named Yoav Gallant, who is a member of Netanyahu's own Likud party, gives a televised address to the Israeli public in which he says, I have been basically begging the political leadership of this country to tell me what is the political strategy for the end of this war, for post-war Gaza. What are we going to actually do with the places that we clear of Hamas? But every time I've raised this with the political leadership, nothing gets done, right? There's no political strategy to this war. In other words, there's only a military strategy. So Israel can win, 100 battles with Hamas, but lose the war because Hamas just comes back to places that Israel defeated it in, because Israel didn't set up new governance there and didn't empower Palestinians to run the place who weren't Hamas. This is all a speech that is a long time in coming. It reflects tremendous discontent in the Israeli defense establishment about sort of the soldiers being sent to fight a war without a political strategy to sort of secure the victory.
Gallant is a member of a 3-person war cabinet with Netanyahu, right?
Yeah, so the war cabinet is Benjamin Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, and Benny Gantz, also a former general, head of the Israel Defense Forces, and he's an opposition party leader who joined the government after October 7th as part of a sort of unity effort to fight Hamas.
That's notable to me just because there's only 3 people around that table. So when you have one coming forward and being like, listen, this isn't working out, that's a big deal.
After he said it, Benny Gantz came out and said, good speech. right? So you basically have two of the three voting members. There are several other members of the war cabinet who are non-voting members, but the two of the three voting members basically came out and said, this war is not being run properly. It doesn't have a post-war strategy. And there's only one other guy, as you suggested, in the war cabinet who they're really talking about. And Gallant, to be clear, he named Netanyahu, and he said Netanyahu needs to make the hard decision here. He has to make a call about turning Gaza back over to Palestinian governments and committing to not occupying it and to not resettling it.
Is it clear to you what's provoking Yoav Gallant and Benny Gantz here?
They're looking at a war that's gone on for over half a year where the objectives haven't been achieved. But worse, this is like what's happened in the last weeks. Israel has been fighting battles in Gaza, in northern Gaza, in neighborhoods where they'd already fought battles, hard-fought battles, and cleared Hamas, or so they thought. But then it seems Hamas came back. And how does that happen? Well, if you don't have a political strategy for areas you conquer and clear of Hamas and set up new governance, right, with like services for people, right, and the humanitarian aid being distributed through those people, and you just leave a vacuum, well, then the most powerful force in Gaza, namely Hamas, will just come back as soon as you leave. And this was kind of foreseeable. This is not something that people didn't know. And Israeli defense establishment figures had been raising this. Gallant said in his speech, I've been raising this since October. Everyone kind of knew that this was something that Israel was going to have to figure out. And yet, no decisions were made. They continue to fight a war, but without a political strategy for what comes after the war in any given part of Gaza.
You say Benjamin Netanyahu has no strategy for exit from Gaza. How can that be true? Like, what does he say when pressed directly on it?
So the story of Netanyahu's political career, and in some ways the secret to his success, is that what he does is keep all of his options open for as long as possible. And there's a good reason why Netanyahu has refused to commit to any sort of end strategy one way or the other, which is that, as we've discussed, I think, on this podcast before, Netanyahu is in a minoritarian government, which is to say his coalition received 48.4% of the vote in the last Israeli election. It did not get more than half. So it's a very rickety government in the first place. It has 64 seats in the Israeli parliament, and some 11 or plus of those seats belong to the far right, belong to people who have a very different idea of what to do with Gaza. Namely, they want to ethnically cleanse some or all the Palestinians and then fill the place with Israeli settlers and settlements. Now, poll shows that most Israelis don't want to do this, but Netanyahu's government is uniquely reliant on the minority that does want to do this. And so you have this situation where Netanyahu is not going to get in, and he's not going to say, I'm going to do what you say, but he's also not going to say, I'm not going to do what you say, right? He's going to just be opaque about it. And that way he keeps his options open. And part of what's going on here is that Gallant and then Benny Gantz, who comes in support of Gallant, and the Biden administration, others are trying to sort of force Netanyahu to choose.
Will that work? I mean, I wonder, will that work? Like, it's like, so I look at Benny Gantz and Yoav Gallant. Benny Gantz is given a deadline. He said, I'm going to quit the government in 3 weeks if Netanyahu doesn't have a plan to replace Hamas in Gaza. That's a bold move, because I'm not sure what Netanyahu's moves are here.
Well, Netanyahu, in point of fact, doesn't need Benny Gantz because, as I mentioned, I think Benny Gantz joined this government from the political opposition after October 7th to have a unity government that would prosecute the war against Hamas. But Netanyahu's government already existed without him. So Benny Gantz leaves, Netanyahu's back to his narrow coalition that still functions. So actually more threatening to him is Yoav Gallant, who is a member of his own coalition. Gallant is speaking for more than just himself within the Netanyahu cabinet and the Netanyahu government. There are other members of Knesset who are sort of behind Gallant but aren't saying it publicly. You've had some who started to say publicly they oppose an Israeli occupation of Gaza. So at a certain point, it basically becomes a question of whether or not, Netanyahu has those 64 seats or if there's under 60. Benny Gantz himself can put political pressure, but he can't break the coalition. That can only happen from the inside with Yoav Gallant and probably other members of the Likud party.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
I'm Jerusalem Demsis. I'm a writer at The Atlantic. And my beat, in many ways, is to challenge the conventional wisdom. I've written about how the problem with local democracy might just be too much voting, about how some environmental laws actually squash green energy development, and about how maybe the big demographic question of the day isn't overpopulation, but underpopulation. My new show is called Good on Paper. It questions what we really know about popular narratives with a new guest every Tuesday. Find and follow Good on Paper from The Atlantic, wherever you get your podcasts.
In France, in the 13th century, a teenager ascends the throne. He seems calm, collected, and as it happens, drop-dead gorgeous. But looks can be deceiving, and no one is ready for the death, destruction, and chaos that lie ahead. Step inside the reign of one of the Middle Ages' most cold-blooded rulers on This Is History presents The Iron King, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Okay, so we talked about how these internal pressures are mounting, especially inside Israel. I want to talk about external pressures when it comes to the war on Gaza, because over the last week, those pressures have been mounting as well. On Monday of this week, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court announced he was seeking arrest warrants for leaders of Israel and Hamas. These were arrest warrants over actions taken during this 7-month war. And we've known for a while the ICC was considering charging these leaders. I guess I wonder, though, were you surprised?
I'm not surprised that they filed, once they did file, that they filed against both Israeli leaders and Hamas leaders, because it's sort of a way to insulate themselves from criticism from either direction. Look, we're impartial. We're doing both. But the ICC prosecutor went to Israel and the West Bank in December, at the very beginning of December, and he went to the site of the Hamas massacres. And he said that there was reason to believe, his words, that war crimes had been committed by Hamas there. And then he didn't charge anybody until this month, when he could do it with Israel too. So the idea that this is sort of like, that's not on purpose, because again, it gives a certain amount of political cover to doing it. But the more normal thing would have been simply to charge Hamas when Hamas did its things. Because remember, Hamas broadcast its atrocities. It did not hide them. And the prosecutor himself went there and saw it. And he said that he saw it. And then he didn't charge until now. And I think that has made a lot of people who are now criticizing, saying your statement makes equivalence between Israel and Hamas, regardless of who has committed crimes. It makes that criticism a lot stronger. So it's a political act, and I'm not sure it's going to have the impact that they think that they would like it to have. By putting Israel and Hamas in the same sentence and doing this at the same time, it forced a lot of Israeli politicians who have otherwise been very critical of Netanyahu to say, but well, that we don't think is okay.
Yeah. It's worth noting that none of the people who potentially will be charged here are facing imminent arrest. Like, a panel of 3 judges still has to decide whether to actually issue arrest warrants. And then even if those get approved, Israel isn't a member of the International Criminal Court. So it isn't part of the ICC's jurisdiction. It kind of makes me wonder if these charges matter.
So although the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction over the United States, doesn't have jurisdiction over Israel itself, there are a whole bunch of countries, including many European countries, that are signed up to the ICC and would be obliged, if these warrants were approved, to arrest the people that the warrants were filed against, and in practice the Israeli leaders, if they were to land in their countries. It would be an interesting question whether all of these governments would comply. It would be a test case for the ICC that has never really been tested in this way. So it could really shrink where Netanyahu can travel to and go and things like that, which is not nothing, right? So there's a symbolic thing, and there's also some practical consequences to particular people.
I do wonder if over the last week you were feeling like, oh, there's interesting internal pressures in Israel that might move the war closer to a resolution. And then these ICC charges happened, and it just sort of felt like it threw cold water on all that.
Yeah, I do think that it takes many of the forces that were pressuring Netanyahu and forced them to sort of defend on principle the idea that Israel and Hamas are not equivalent, right, that they shouldn't be charged in the same way. And so that is, beneficial to Netanyahu and alleviates the pressure that he was receiving from opposition politicians, from the defense establishment, from the Biden administration. All of these groups suddenly have to come out and say, well, on this one thing, we don't like the guy, but this is a bit nuts, right? That sort of thing. And that isn't, and again, I don't, I don't think that you can always game out the long-term consequences of things. And I will say also the ICC prosecutor very deliberately, he charged Netanyahu and he charged Gallant, did not charge Benny Gantz, right, who's the opposition leader, who's in the war cabinet and leading in the polls against Netanyahu. So it's possible that he thought in his head that this is something that will put more pressure on Netanyahu and make it more likely that at some point he loses an election. Because here's a person who has warrants out on his head and makes him hard to be the prime minister, and it hurts Israel, so then they'll vote for somebody else. So it's possible he was thinking in those terms. I don't think was a good bet, but it's possible that he was trying to game this out too. It's very hard. It's very complicated.
So we have a deadline coming up. Like Benny Gantz has said, 3 weeks to sort out how we have some kind of political resolution in Gaza. Over the next 3 weeks, what are you looking for to take place in Israel, in Gaza, throughout the Middle East?
I'm going to watch to see, first, if Gantz is getting ready to sort of not just pull out of Netanyahu's unity government, but also to start running a de facto election campaign against him. Sort of saying we need to start choosing, we need to start having a real contest to find out who's going to lead us and what we're going to do. I'm also going to be watching who lines up behind Yoav Gallant within the coalition, right? So Yoav Gallant is a member of Netanyahu's Likud party, and he's come out against Netanyahu's broader war strategy or lack thereof. At least one other member of Knesset who's quite right-wing, who's a member of the Likud party, yesterday also came out and said anyone who wants Israel to occupy Gaza after this war will have to explain it to the mothers of all the soldiers who are going to die administering that occupation. So that's two, right? That's two people now. How many other people start speaking up? How many other people start talking about how Netanyahu doesn't seem to want to make the hard calls on this?
There's also the matter of the International Criminal Court warrants. Yair says in practice, warrants are almost always approved. And while that's playing out, another international proceeding against Israel is waiting in the wings.
The ICJ, the International Court of Justice, recently heard more arguments from South Africa and others arguing that they should issue some sort of more stringent orders against Israel, aiming to stop it from operating near or in Rafah, the last sort of stronghold of Hamas in Gaza. And that's expected probably within a week. And so what that actually says and, whether it actually matters, a lot of interesting questions about that as well.
I can't tell if all this external pressure is doing anything or whether it's just strengthening Israeli leaders' resolve.
It's very hard to say, but especially because, as we've discussed, some of these pressures seem to go at opposite ends, right? They seem to be counteracting each other. It's not all going in the same direction, and that enables inertia rather than movement. It's not like everything's pushing in one direction. It's sort of like the Biden administration and Yoav Gallant and the Israeli defense establishment and others are pushing Netanyahu in one direction, but then you have the ICC warrants, which sort of cause even Netanyahu's critics internationally and domestically to sort of say, well, this isn't fair, right? Or this isn't done right. And that helps him and also alleviates the general controversy over the other things because the conversation becomes about the ICC for a few days. So it's really hard to know, right, which of these wins out in the long term.
Yair, I'm really grateful for your time and your reporting. Thanks for coming on the show.
Always good to be here. One day we'll talk baseball.
Yair Rosenberg is a staff writer at The Atlantic. He's also the author of its newsletter Deep Shtetl, about the intersection of politics, culture, and religion.
Are you denying that the plan is for an occupation of Gaza, or are you taking it off the table?
No, I have a very clear plan. I think the first thing...
After we taped this conversation, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu turned up on CNN. He was asked to respond to his war cabinet's assertion that he's got no plan for a political future in Gaza. He denied that allegation. Netanyahu also claimed he wants to put Palestinians in charge of the Gaza Strip, eventually. And he seemed to reject the far right's plan to permanently occupy the territory.
If you mean resettling Gaza, yeah, it was never in the cards, and I said so openly, and some of my constituents are not happy about it, but that's my position. The third thing that I would...
That is our show. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Madeline Ducharme, and Anna Phillips. We are led by Alicia Montgomery with a little boost from Susan Matthews. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. Catch you back here next time.
McDonald's presents Burger Reviews by Hamburglar. Today's review, the hotter, juicier classic burgers. Mr. Hamburglar. Robble, robble. He said, of all the McDonald's burgers I've ever hamburgled, these are the hottest, juiciest, and tastiest. Brabble.
Hamburglary is on the rise. Get caught with a medium double cheeseburger meal for $6. Price and participation may vary. Promotion pricing may be lower than meal price. Comparison to prior classic burgers.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.